Well, I have known Madhu for, I think, almost 20 years. I think it was around 2007 that we first met at a Science Online conference. And we are both science writers and educators. And we became friends quite quickly. And our conversations, as they often do with me, go in all kinds of directions. And when I read that he had a new paper in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution on decolonizing ecology, I was quick to read it, and I thought this needs to be discussed more widely. So we organized a group of amazing writers that have now published the new PDF that we have on our website under the special publications channel on decolonizing science. And it's just a great pleasure to see Madhu again and to hear him talk about this topic that has been um, on his mind for many, many years.
Thank you, Eric, for organizing and inviting us to do this. Yeah, it's. I was trying to remember when was the last time we actually met in person. I think it was before, maybe around the time I was preparing to move from Fresno to North Carolina. Anyway, uh, nice to see all of you here on a Monday morning or a Monday night for Amitangshu. Uh, my name is Madhusudan Katti. I usually go by Madhu. I've been a faculty member at North Carolina State University for about 9 years now. Before that, I was at California State University in Fresno for 12 years. And I have a background, you know, training in evolutionary ecology, focusing on birds in particular. But for the last 20 years, I've been studying biodiversity in urban contexts. And in the course of that, my work has become more and more transdisciplinary, which is part of how that paper on decolonizing ecology came about. And also, for the most recently, I've been directing the Science, Technology, and Society program at NC State, uh, and I'll leave it at that.
Hi everyone, this is Amitangshu. I am a lecturer in water governance at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education in the Netherlands, which is a UNESCO Tier 2 institute that is probably the only institute in the world that specializes on water education. But I'm a political ecologist by training. I studied at the University of Edinburgh, and I have been meandering because I was a practitioner in India for several years. I worked in ecosystems and community protection of commons for many years, and then moved into research and then into academia. So I also kind of write in as a journalist. So I've been writing for the Huffington Post, I've written for the Economist and other such outlets, The Independent. And also, of late, I'm writing for Places, which has been a fascinating experience. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. So and my journey into decolonization, actually, there's a story behind this. Madhu and I collaborate for a PhD course on decolonizing science, which we host at IHE Delft Institute for Water Education since 2023. And that's the starting point of our collaboration, Madhu and I, that went back to, start in 2023 between the two of us. So yeah, I
Um,
thought what we
yeah.
could do was, like start talking about
Mhm.
how did we arrive at this juncture in
Yeah.
towards at decolonizing science and decolonizing ecology. What kind of life experiences brought us here? And I thought that would be an interesting
Yeah.
kind of way to start this conversation before we go on to more,
Sure.
more theoretical, more empirical discussions. Just our own embodied experience
Yeah.
of this. So, would you want to start off? So, how did
Sure.
your journey, begin? How did you move
Yeah.
towards this?
Sure. Yes. Uh, you know, like you, both of us grew up in India, which is in a post-colonial, so to speak, era in political terms. But my education very much was in the Western scientific sort of tradition, right? And also I got into ecology at a time when ecology or wildlife biology was not much of a career in India. There were not many places where you could get a graduate degree studying wildlife. There were the standard biology degrees that were more oriented towards physiology and medicine and those kinds of things. So I got the opportunity to be part of the very first wildlife biology, wildlife sciences master's program at the then new Wildlife Institute of India in North India. And that was partly because I had been seeking some opportunities like that, because I had been in my reading and sort of growing understanding of science and the world, I was very much focused on trying to understand and trying to address the various environmental issues that were really becoming more and more acute in India. And my own thinking on this sort of was influenced a lot by reading Rachel Carson on the one hand, Silent Spring, uh, as well as Barry Commoner, who's somewhat less known, but he was involved in the initial founding of the Earth Day events, uh, and was even a political candidate for president, I think, in the 70s. So his Closing Circle was an influential book for me. At the same time, I was also reading Stephen Jay Gould, and I'd read Darwin. So this was when I was an undergraduate student in Bombay. I was in the University of Mumbai or Bombay, and that's also where I started becoming a bird watcher. Right, I grew up in the suburbs of Bombay, and I was aware of birds and things, but I wasn't formally introduced to identifying them and knowing more about them. So that all started in college when I was around the corner from the Bombay Natural History Society, and so it was kind of a growth of my interest in ecology and evolution, but at the same time being aware of the context in which I was able to see birds in Bombay, for example, and what was happening in terms of environmental changes around me. And then being in Bombay, I was also acutely aware of social inequalities. I was also exposed to the social science literature at the time through my sister, who uh, you know, became a professor in social work in Bombay. So I would say my social conscience, as well as my ecological conscience and my curiosity about evolution, were growing simultaneously. And I think it was the social conscience that kept me questioning the context in which the evolutionary and ecological sciences were coming in the Western framework. So in a sense, this sort of questioning and critique of Western ecology and evolution was always in the background for me from the beginning. And it became more and more prominent as I spent more and more time doing this. And eventually it was like, I have to write about this because I keep thinking about this, I keep talking to people about it. But more people need to start acknowledging the roots of ecology and evolution and start thinking about how we do things differently. So that's brief version of my journey into becoming more of a voice for decolonizing the way we do our work.
Right.
How about you, Amitangshu?
So this is very interesting to listen to Madhu, because I think Madhu and I come from a generation where there were no term papers we had to write on these things. It was something that we had to navigate through our own lived experience and
Yeah.
through the work we did. And so just like Madhu, you talked about Bombay. So I studied in Bombay for my postgraduate degree at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And I landed up with an activist organization, the National Alliance for People's Movement, because there was a agitation against the Coca-Cola plant, an American company, who was setting up plants in the state of Kerala in India, and they were abstracting huge amounts of groundwater, and it created an agricultural crisis because there was no water for the farmers to till their land. And this historically is one of the longest protests outside a plant in India that was happening in Plachimada. It was a really long period of time. And I, as a student, joined that group, and to understand, I did some research for them. And that was my entry into the world of, and of course, that's the first point you realize that environmental justice and social justice questions are entangled. There's no separation between the two. And but again, you of course understand capitalism and you see it happening in front of you, what its the effects are. But coloniality and how it shapes our worldviews is still not emerging on the scene, till I kind of meet a very interesting person who becomes a mentor to me in my later years, called who's Dr. Dhrubajyoti Ghosh. And I think I've referred to him earlier in
Yeah.
some of our conversations. So for those of you who are part of this conversation, Dhruvajyoti Ghosh was a Luke Hoffman Award winner. He was a wetland ecologist, and he was also a he was a United Nations fellow. And he is known for the conservation of the East Kolkata wetlands. Now, if you haven't heard of the East Kolkata wetlands, I'm very happy to introduce that concept to you because it's a large wetland system that exists on the outskirts of the city of Calcutta in the eastern part of India. And it is basically an artificial wetland system that treats most of the sewage and wastewater that comes out of the city and produces fish and food and takes it back to the city. And Dhruvajyoti Ghosh studied this system for almost 15 years. He was active in getting it recognized in Ramsar site. And so he was the person who first told me about the frustrations of doing this kind of ecology, the work around ecology, because people would not take it seriously. The fact that poor fisher folk could show so much wisdom in reconstituting, waste into resource would not be acknowledged. And that's really got me into interest in knowledge politics and the politics of how knowledge is framed within colonial context. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's the starting point.
Yeah, it reminds me also of, being in Wildlife Institute of India. Even there, I felt this tension because that institute came out of the Indian Forest Service, the Forest Department, which, we don't have a separate wildlife service in India. It's all part of the Forest Service, which is a colonial, bureaucratic organization created by the British, the world's first forest service, really. And being a national, bureaucracy, they still very much have that colonial attitude in the background. And the Wildlife Institute of India, I always felt this tension because there was very much, it was part of back in the day, those days, there was this perceived divide between people and wildlife, that people were perceived as being a problem for wildlife. And there were all these attempts to move people out of national parks because they're inherently supposed to be bad. And I got into a lot of arguments with my professors over that at the time. And I remember also being part of a field survey of the upper parts of the Narmada River in Madhya Pradesh before the Narmada, at the time when the dam was being built. And this was one of the wildlife surveys of an area that was scheduled to be underwater, and I believe it is underwater now. And as the Wildlife Institute was a federal organization that was asked to conduct these wildlife surveys as an impact assessment. And of course, it didn't really make much of a difference in terms of the project going through. But that was, an interesting experience to sort of see where the bureaucracy is, what people's attitudes are. And I think you well know these tensions between the people versus wildlife dichotomies that have been set up in
Absolutely.
India that really are premised in the colonial mindset of humans and nature being separate categories. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the way ecology and conservation have grown, and the models of conservation that have been set up. And I believe that it's caused more harm than good, even if there are national parks that supposedly have protected wildlife in many places. But I don't know if that's viable in the long term. And I've also come to, now describing national parks as effectively colonial crime scenes, right? Because they're premised on the idea that people don't belong in nature. And in many places, starting with the North American model of national parks, Yellowstone, Yosemite, in particular Yosemite, where indigenous people were forcibly removed from Yosemite Valley because conservationists at the time, led by John Muir, wanted to preserve what they thought was the pristine nature of the park. So rip people away because people are inherently bad without considering what the actual interactions between people and nature were in that context. And in the process, damage both the human communities as well as the ecological communities. And again, Yosemite has become an example of, I think, that the consequences of that because of the fire regimes that we are seeing now. Because one of the things they did after removing people was to suppress fires, because again, forestry science at the time said that fires are bad for trees inherently. And again, this was forestry as a resource-oriented sort of colonial mindset, not actually looking at these as dynamic ecosystems with people being part of them. But that model has become the template for national parks around the world. And in Indian law, the national parks are defined as places where people cannot be present inside, not living, other than tourists or something like that. So with that strict definition has meant a lot of people being displaced. And there are many examples. I'm actually working with someone here to do a systematic review to see how many national parks where people have been removed have resulted in adverse ecological outcomes, such as shrinking of grasslands because people were removed, and that brought back succession, shrinking of wetlands in a place like Bharatpur. So there's a number of places where, however good the intentions were, this colonial model has caused more damage to what it was supposed to protect, even, right? So it's not just damaging people, but it damages the environment itself because we don't consider them as being part of one system. And that, I think, is one of the more damaging consequences of this colonial thinking, which is in the Western scientific tradition that humans are considered as a separate category from nature. It's only recently, with the growth of more systems thinking, that we're talking about human social ecological systems and trying to look at things in a more integrated way. But we have a long way to go.
Great. In fact, it's when you talk about Yosemite, I'm just thinking about the national parks in India,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm thinking of what was coming to my mind was this interaction I had with a forester, and of course, these institutions are reproducing coloniality. And the fact is, I keep thinking about this, that while we talk about, we have colonial laws and a Brahminical social order.
Yes.
And when these two come together, it amplifies some of the pathologies that emerges from colonialism.
Yeah.
So that is something that we haven't really kind of delved much into in our discussions on decolonization in India, for example, in the earlier writings that have emerged. But while I was talking to this forester, I was doing my master's research on the cultural politics of sacred groves in the eastern Himalayas, and this was in a state called Sikkim, and which actually borders China, as you know. And he was sitting there, and just like I'm sitting, he had these, photos behind him, and these photos were basically of herders' huts being set ablaze. So he had become very successful in removing yak herders from the high altitude buffer zones of the Kanchenjunga National Park. And he had not only removed them, he burned down their huts as well, so they could not even come back. So when you say colonial crime scenes, this is, and this is a celebration because he had those pictures in the back. So I didn't know about this, so I asked him that. So what was this about? And he started talking about how, and you have these indexes in biodiversity, right? So there's Shannon Miller and there are all kinds of indexes, right? So he was talking about how the index has gone up, and then somewhere he stops and he says, but there is a problem that I did not think of. And I was okay. There are many problems, but specifically what would hold appeal to him? And he basically tells me a story about how these herders have been practicing grazing there for hundreds of years. And in the process, the manure they deposited there made it a habitat for the dung beetles. And these dung beetles were food source for the wild boars. So when he removed all the graziers from the outer reaches of the national park, the wild boars lost its food source, and it started coming downhill, like further down to look for food. And of course, it encountered the croplands of the farmers who were in the villages in the lower reaches, and the crop attacks that increased manifold. And now he was basically running around paying compensation and dealing with all these problems that had emerged from his own action. And it hadn't taken much time. Within 5 or 6 years it had become a huge problem. And for me, that was that was quite surprising, that he was actually at one hand being celebrated and valorized for this enclosure he managed to bring about. and the ecological harm it produced. And and if you were to look for this online or search for it, you'll still not find a single
Yeah.
research that has
Yeah.
happened on this topic. But this was
Yeah.
something that he was, talking to you about. And I kind of related to your experience
Yeah.
of talking about national parks in the US and what was happening here.
Yeah. I mean, Bharatpur, the Keoladeo National Park, which is, for those of you who may not know about it, it's actually within an hour or so drive from the Taj Mahal. It's in northern India. It's celebrated as one of the World Heritage Sites, as a wetland, a site where you get, hundreds of thousands of migratory birds, especially waterfowl, during the winter, coming from all across, Eurasia, including a number of endangered species that used to be the only wintering spot for some species at least the population of the Siberian crane that used to come there, I think, may have gone extinct now. I do remember seeing it though once. But what the story of that park is sort of illustrative to me also of how colonial thinking works, and how it causes problems for the way we perceive the world. So the way the national park was created was, it had been sort of a protected area as a sanctuary in post-independence India, but you still had people, villages around the park being able to go inside, and they would graze their cattle in there and collect firewood and things like that. And in the 70s, during Indira Gandhi's regime, when conservation sort of really took off in India, I think we had the Indian Wildlife Act was passed in 1973, and national parks became this sort of powerful tool of conservation. So in 1980, they got that, it was conservationists led by the Bombay Natural Resources Society who got Bharatpur designated as a national park. And by definition, legally, national park meant people cannot do any extractive activities inside. And of course, this park was only about 30 square kilometers. So it's a small enough park that they were able to literally build a wall around it to keep people out. And in doing so, of course, the villagers were upset. There were protests that became violent when police opened fire on the crowd. A few people got killed, but it went through. Right, this is a small enough place, very prominent, very populated area in the Gangetic Plain. They built a wall around it. It became a national park, and the Bombay Natural Resources Society also at that point had established a research station there to monitor the the wildlife and the ecology, to study things over there. And I actually remember meeting as an undergraduate when we had a field trip to Bharatpur. I met one of the scientists there. That was one of the inspirations for me to consider studying birds could be a career. Right? So it was a turning point for me. But also at the same time, this was in the mid 80s, and I was already hearing from them, meeting them there, that they were beginning to see problems from having removed the grazing. One of the things that the same scientists who had advocated for this park started noticing was that the wetland was shrinking. And why was that happening? Because of the natural process of succession. Right? So when you have aquatic plants that grow on the edges of these lakes, will start, shrinking the water body. You get more land emerging and so on. So the wetland was becoming smaller, which was crucial habitat for all these endangered bird species. And so that became a concern, and they realized that this was happening because cattle were no longer being allowed to come and graze in there. And the cattle used to eat these aquatic plants, and they also trampled the vegetation and the soil, which sort of broke up the shore and kept the wetland, and also kept the nutrients in the water that was beneficial for the waterfowl. So by removing cattle, they had created the conditions which were adverse for the wetland that they were trying to protect. And so that's one level of sort of misunderstanding. And then they had to come up with, and they've still been struggling, I think, to come up with ways to do other interventions that might mimic that, having people physically go and remove these things. Because obviously, once you've taken the command action of sort of removing people and cattle from this park, you can't go back and break the wall down and let them all back in, right? That's again the model. So they've been struggling to figure out how to recreate that impact of the cattle. But something else that I realized when looking at the history of the park is that this was not a natural wetland at all, right? Bharatpur, it's a fantastic wetland. It's a great place to visit to see birds, but it had been created several hundred years earlier when a local king, this is during the British colonial rule in India, and the way the British, gave patronage to Indian kings was to let them keep the title, and they would occasionally get to visit, the king and queen in England and get that royal blessing. So this guy had visited England and saw how they did their duck hunting there, right, as a royal sport. So he figured I should go back and do the same thing. And there used to be this low-lying area near the Yamuna River where you would get birds in the winter. So he decided to divert water from there to create this permanent wetland, which then became this Bharatpur Sanctuary and National Park. So here you have a wetland that was created because of a colonial, influence from what he saw, in England, and then it becomes this really significant wildlife habitat. But then you end up with this adverse outcome in the end as well, and we're still struggling to figure out how best to manage this. I think I'm rambling a bit on about this, but one thing I want to ask, something you said earlier, it might be good to define some terms for people here, which is you mentioned coloniality, and we're talking about
Right.
decolonization. And I know we talk about the distinctions between decolonization, post-colonial, and decoloniality. So do you want to elaborate on that for people who may not know?
So, I mean, it's so there are varying interpretations, and everybody will have a
Yeah.
certain other, certain different way of explaining this. To perhaps try and do this very simply, decolonization is the broader umbrella, the way I look at it, and within which there is different kinds of approaches. There are anti-colonial, thinking. There is decoloniality, which is largely coming from South American scholars. There's post-colonialism and post-colonial approaches, which are coming from South Africa, South Asia, and Africa, and of course West Asia. For example, Edward Said is one of the most well-known post-colonial scholars. And there are different ways by which these approaches engage with questions of coloniality, and of course also with science. And I think the decolonial imagination is a far more radical project that looks at reimagining society's relationship with science and how it kind of looks at nature as a category, while post-colonialism tries to understand the entanglements of the colonizer and the colonized in the way it kind of produces worlds and co-constitutes it. And so yeah, I mean, depends on which approach you take. You would perhaps take there'll be a there are of course many intersections between these approaches, of course, but and it depends on which approach one is taken. I largely come from a post-colonial and anti-colonial school of thinking, while so I think
Yeah.
Madhu, you also come from an anti-colonial, decolonial kind of school.
Yeah, and for our paper, we had some discussions about this, and we chose to use the word decoloniality in the title of our paper. In part, also again, sort of thinking about what these different terms mean, and since then, uh, as my reading in this has deepened, I've also come to appreciate the critiques from North American indigenous scholars about how these terms are applied, because we have a settler colonial state that I live in here. And so post-colonial doesn't really work because it's still a colony. It's still a colonial dynamic. So post-colonial at least refers to where political change has happened. But as we see in India and many other places, the political change is not accompanied by changing of the way we think and the deeper ways that colonial thinking sort of becomes part of the mindset as well. So whereas in indigenous scholars in the US have argued that decolonization should mean really change in power structures and giving back the land, starting with giving back the land, right? So, there's a famous paper titled Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which critiques this use of this term, which has become somewhat loose, that you can decolonize this or that. even when we talk about decolonizing science, we have to be careful about how we use that term. And that's where I think decoloniality gives a framework to think about it in terms of what has happened in post-colonial societies, countries, as well as in this context where coloniality is more of a mindset, or partly at least a mindset. So it's not just physical land and power systems and those things that are colonial, but you also have epistemic coloniality. So
And
decoloniality is a
cognitive.
project for also transforming the way we think about knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, how we relate to the world. So that epistemic project is what I most engage with as as an academic and as myself also from a post-colonial nation, but now living in a settled colonial state. Uh, that's kind of where I see. I also feel friction about the work I'm doing because I feel a contradiction in that I'm a professor at a land grab university, or what's called a land grant university in the US, which essentially means the federal government of the US, under these acts after the Civil War, uh, appropriated land and used the resources from the land to establish these universities as a public good. But these lands came from indigenous people. So they took stolen land and either built universities on the land directly or sold the land to get funding to support universities. So I'm in one of these universities, which has a mission to serve the state of North Carolina. So there's a positive element to that in terms of what the mission of the university is. But at the same time, you can't get away from the colonial history of how it started and how it relates as well. So one of the other contradictions I live with is that my primary appointment here is in the College of Natural Resources. And to me, that framing itself is a colonial framing of nature. Right? I think of myself as a natural scientist, and I'm motivated by curiosity about nature and trying to understand how nature works and how we fit into it. But the natural resources frame makes me uncomfortable. And in a way, I guess discomfort is good because that's kind of where we thrive. Academics, at least, we like we need to have some discomfort in the way we look at the world. But those are sources of friction for me in my current work as well. And I don't know if you've experienced something like that also.
So when I was listening to you, I was remembering. So one of the a very powerful text that I read recently was Malcolm Ferdinand's Decolonial Ecology, which I would recommend everyone to engage with. It's a beautifully written
Mm-hmm.
book. And he makes a very interesting comparison. He, of course, he takes a decolonial approach to his work. And he kind of argues the need for placing ethics above above ontology in our discussions on decoloniality and decolonizing ecology. And he specifically chooses to stay away from using the term decolonization. So hence the title of his book. And it's a very interesting example. He talks about how most of the construction of conservation, if you look at from the Western episteme, is coming from the conceptualization of a ship, which is Noah's Ark.
Mm-hmm.
But what he does, he
Yeah.
kind of reinvents that, and he says, but what if we were to look at it from a slave ship, from the hold of a slave ship?
Yeah.
How would our perception of this, this construction of nature change? And I think this is a very interesting way of looking at it, that how you could
Mm-hmm.
completely change your perspective from a decolonial approach if you were to look at it from that, from the perspective of the enslaved.
Yeah.
So, and which is very relevant even now, right? I mean,
Yeah.
for the way we're looking and engaging with social justice issues. So yeah, I was
wonder
actually
if
thinking of that as well.
I
Yeah.
wonder if we might proceed to the Q&A section and
Yeah,
let this
sure.
conversation be guided by our guest here. And Cheryl, you're right up there, first mover here. So lovely to hear from you. And please, others, raise your hands to form a queue, your virtual hands to form a queue, and let's see what we have to say here.
Well, one of the things that I really resonated with is this idea of how interconnected we are. Humans bring something to the equation that is really broadens, in my mind, the concept of colonialization, because what we bring is categorizing and othering.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We bring that in, and that's a belief system. That's not natural. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a belief system And for example, the broadest colonization that I see, obviously, around the world of human societies is colonialization of the female body. So this is
Oh, yeah.
very, very broad. And I like what I'm really hearing that I really like is this idea that we are so interconnected that when we start othering, we have already placed ourselves outside that
Yes.
interconnection.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important point. And I think in that sense, decolonization or decoloniality is very much at the intersection of, dealing with other systems of othering and oppression, including patriarchy, capitalism. This is like, as bell hooks are formalized, sort of this cis hetero patriarchy and colonialism and colonial capitalism, right? All of these are intersecting together to create this the injustice we see in the world, both towards people as well as towards other non-human beings. So yeah, I think it's part of the same project.
Right. And I'm just also thinking, Cheryl, that the fact is that, of course, we are coming to this debate with a particular male gaze
Mm-hmm.
that we are trying to unsettle as we move forward in our work. But that is the problem here is that we often encounter this when we talk about decolonization, that the male gaze plays a significant role even in
Yep.
looking at histories of oppression. So the history of oppression can also be spoken purely in terms of the male gaze.
Mm-hmm.
And that is so it's very important that you bring that forward, because even in discussions on decolonizing ecology, this has not been prodded enough, I believe, especially in the research that we do in different parts of the world. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah,
Yeah, and just a quick thought on that also. In terms of gendering, one of the things that struck me as odd coming from India, where I'm growing up in languages that don't necessarily have gendering of everything. One of the things that always made me sort of felt funny to me is how gendered the English language is when it comes to describing other animals, and how
Mhm.
often the default is to describe something as male. So you end up with the Bee movie featuring a male lead when the entire organization of bees is very different. So anyway, David, interrupt you.
so I mean, it seems to me that when we talk about colonialism, we're really talking about power imbalances in all their
Mhm.
forms. The most general expression, and the culprit, you might say, is power imbalances, which manifest today in colonialism, make no mistake, but also exist in so many other manifestations that if we could have some kind of general theory for how societies function well thanks to checks and balances and being organized against the abuse of power, then we will be addressing colonialism plus sexism plus so much more. And we can see. So what do you think about that? That really to put your finger on the problem. When we say colonialism, I feel that that's like not quite general enough. And it's unchecked power that we need to be thinking about. What do you think about that? Is it,
I think, there is something to think about there, but I also am wary of sort of generalizing across humanity, given the history of how divisions within humanity have created a lot of our problems. So the power imbalances between societies is part of what we talk about in in terms of colonialism. But I think, and I also think of this because this is not the only way that human beings have organized themselves, right? Yes, power has always been a part of it, but there are a lot of other indigenous forms of thinking, ways of knowing that don't make that distinction between humans and non-humans, for example, right?
oh, I think that's
Yeah.
I mean, a separate, very important topic. So the idea of the division of humans
It's not
and
it,
nature is
it's
a very well taken point and additional to what I was saying about power.
no, I think it goes a bit beyond that, because it's also about whether we place hierarchies of power or not. Because if human beings are part of this whole web of nature with no hierarchy, then the consideration of power changes fundamentally, I think, because you're defining yourself in relationship to other beings in nature as a relational approach rather than a hierarchical and transactional approach that we have in colonialism.
Yeah.
So I think that is a fundamental distinction to me, and it is about power. It is about how power is perceived and who is supposed to have power. And I think this is where we do need to rethink how we organize ourselves. But I think we need to start looking at other ways of other societies have thought about it in the past, and continue to do so now, even though they may not be powerful in the current socio-political systems. I don't know what you think of that, Amitangshu.
No, I was actually, so what David was saying, it also resonates with me because today the challenge is how do we stop reproducing
Mhm.
coloniality
Mhm.
in the things, the way we look at the world and the way we
Yeah.
kind of, engage with our research and our science. And I think the problem here is that, I mean, from a post-colonial perspective, we are inheriting forms of rule and institutions that have already cemented a particular way of looking at the world. If I look at all the bureaucracies, the forestry institutions, the water management institutions, the courts, they are basically institutions mostly geared towards subjection and towards maintaining control. And this is something Frantz Fanon already, warned everyone about, that when a nationalist struggle emerges as an anti-colonial struggle, the it'll be a kind of it'll inherit the structures of colonial power. Now, this is what we are dealing with because we have inherited those structures, and certain other forms of oppression, like for example in India, Brahminism, has intersected with these structures and amplified itself.
Yeah.
And now to unsettle that now, and this is also an important point because I feel that sometimes in the discussion of decolonization, the focus becomes too Anglo-American and Europe-centric in its trajectory. But somewhere we also have to now start bringing in the discussion about how other forms and other structures also interweave with colonial forms of
Yeah.
power,
No,
and
that's
they hold. And now if you
Yeah.
have to unsettle it, it just can't be one aspect of it, but the
Yeah.
other one as well.
yeah.
So that
Yeah.
is actually the main challenge we have at this point of time.
Yeah, we have some chat questions. And Juliet, could you list out the chat questions? And then I would invite the people who wrote the questions to actually come and speak to us and enter the conversation. So Juliet, do you want to list some of the questions that have been put in chat?
Sure. So Ruth asked for a clarification on the term succession in terms of ecology. So I'm not sure if you have a specific question there. I saw that you provided some resources already, Madhu.
Yeah. I gave it's a well-known, well-described phenomenon in ecology in terms of how ecosystems evolve, if you will, over
Sure.
time. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we also have another question. How does your thinking relate to post-humanism, and specifically in reference to Rosie Braidotti's work?
Are you familiar with Braidotti's work, Amitangshu?
I'm
I'm
not.
not either.
I must. Yeah, it is very difficult to stay in touch with most of the writing that happens in such a vast body of work. So my apologies.
But in terms of post-humanism,
So okay, now this actually takes us into a very interesting terrain because where do we locate post-humanism?
yeah,
And I'm thinking partly of Haraway here, and I'm trying to understand.
You might want to
And
succinctly just define it for not everyone in the audience, such as me,
yeah.
he has a crystal clear idea of what
What
posthumanism
post-humanism?
is.
Yeah,
okay, so how do you explain this? So within critical social sciences, there has been within post-structural theory, there has been a move towards understanding the world beyond the constructions of understanding the world outside human construction, to understand the materiality of non-humans and the animation and the vibrancy of non-humans in the way they shape human society. And that essentially is a way to kind of understand the fact that it kind of unsettles the role of human as the
Mhm.
centerpiece
Yeah.
of all action happening. So it kind
Yeah.
of brings in the agency and of other
Beings. Yeah.
agents into the way it shapes our world. So it's not just
Yeah.
us. So I'm
Yeah.
trying to be as, try and
Mhm.
explain it as simply as possible. I'm sure my colleagues in the social sciences would hate me for what I did just now, and my apologies to the community. But I'm assuming that it's,
But yeah.
it's coming from a point of, trying to explain it in a simple term. Madhu, you have an advantage there because you teach undergrads. I don't.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
I think fundamentally the core thing to in this context is this idea of decentering humans, right? It's a critique of anthropocentric worldviews and relations of power. But also, so one of the ways that I'm directly engaging with that right now is in the movements for rights of nature. Right? So this is a growing movement around the world. I've participated in a tribunal for rights of nature here in North Carolina last year. And I'm engaging with some indigenous groups here who are pushing for legislation in North Carolina to legally recognize the rights of rivers, because rivers are under severe stress in North Carolina with a huge amount of pollution, industrial farming and things like that. But also indigenous communities are trying to restore their native lands here. So the rights of nature framework is one approach to decentering humans and recognizing that other non-human beings should also be considered to have rights and agency. And and in that sense, that's one way. And the other thing, I describe my own research framework as reconciliation ecology, right? So which at one level is sort of applying what we know from evolutionary ecology to reconciling humans with nature. But more deeply, I think it also draws from the idea of reconciliation that happened in South Africa, the ongoing reconciliation efforts in Canada and other places, where it's also a question of accountability for humans towards nature. I see a hand from Ashley.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to build on what you were just talking about and see if either of you have suggestions on people who aren't scientists or academics. What can we do, like in our everyday lives, or to become more active in supporting decolonization? So practical actions like supporting indigenous-led conservation or anything like that. So what are some things that you see that we can do beyond just academia?
Yeah, I think one of the things that a simple thing that you can start with, especially in North America, is by starting to look at sort of the history of where you are, right? Who were the people who have lived in the place that you're in now? Of course, you have this concept of land acknowledgements, which has limited, sometimes performative sort of roles, but there is a website called nativeland.ca, native-land, I think. I mean, we can drop the link here, but that website will tell you they've been engaged in this project of mapping where different indigenous people groups lived. So you could look at that and say, okay, no, this is who lived in this land that we now live in. That's a simple way. But I think it also is important to recognize that while the colonial sort of histories that we read suggest that indigenous people have been wiped out in North America, for example, that's not really the truth. There are a lot of indigenous groups, like the ones that I'm engaging with here, who are involved in current political fights over their land, their rights on how to manage resources in their lands. So things like the pipeline protests in the Dakota pipeline. There's a number of different kind of development projects that are being fought, or issues of environmental justice where indigenous groups have taken the lead. So I would say learn about those, see how you can engage with those, and then talk to people about what they know about the history of where we live, the national narratives, the received sort of stories of what the history of your country is supposed to be versus what actually happened, right? Because there's always a gap between what the official story is versus what happened. And so how did the power relations play out, and who was included and who was excluded from these narratives?
And just to
Thank
add to that,
you.
Madhu, what I
Mm.
sorry, I just actually I just thanks for that. And I thought, from my context, I just wanted to add two things. One is that we need more critical spaces for conversation and dialogue. We really
Yeah.
need that desperately. I mean, whenever we organize this PhD course, it's amazing and it's really surprising to me how PhD students are not finding enough space in the natural sciences and in
Yeah.
STEM fields to talk about these issues. And it kind of really, we need to create as much space as we can for these dialogues to happen. And I
Yeah.
think what follows from that is better organizing. I think we have all realized that the time has come for us to kind of really, it's down to the brass tacks at this point of time for democracy. So how do we do that? It can no longer happen online anymore. We have, in the sense that we have to really start organizing the way it should be done. It's reclaiming the streets, basically, is the way forward. And also the fact is that we need also curriculum change. I think,
Yes.
Madhu, you'll agree with me. This is a
Yes.
serious problem
Yes.
because it
Yes.
doesn't matter who enters the forestry service or the water engineering division, they're still following 1940s
Yeah.
manuals.
Yeah.
So there is nothing that's going to change unless we change this curriculum. And
Yeah.
that itself will only emerge from a political change. So it's, yeah. So just
Yeah.
want to add that. Thanks, Ashley, for that.
Yeah. I see a few other hands up. Abhaya?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your discussion. Amitangshu, your point about how Brahminical casteist oppression coexist with colonial imperialism, that really is so important and unfortunately really less talked about. So I really appreciated that. My question is about when we do articulate and theorize decolonization of Indian ecology in solidarity with indigenous thinkers, how do we prevent homogenization of Indianness, especially considering caste hierarchies that are embedded in larger everyday South Asian context as well as in the academia, when in the current, like especially in this current hyper casteist, fascist, capitalist context, and also Adivasi communities and Dalit landless laborers have always been working with the land, but always on the caste privileged landowners' land, and also which also managed by colonial regimes. And especially as a Dalit person myself, when we talk about human and non-human, nowadays it is heartbreaking to see humanhood is assumed to be homogenized, and
Yes.
how caste privileged scholars also pass with their own privileges while talking
Yes.
about de and anti-colonization, and don't see the crucial connection between decolonization and de-Brahmanization. So I wanted to ask for, I don't know, guidance or like because it seems like the erasure is so
Yeah.
massive that I don't know how to even where to even begin with. Like I have to literally explain what caste is in art academia where I am situated, and it just
Yeah.
feels so overwhelming. Thank you.
Yeah.
You want?
Madhu? Okay. So,
Yeah.
Abhaya, yeah. So no, thank you so much for that. And this is a conversation that ideally we should be having more. We, in the larger discussion on decolonization, these nuances and these important aspects often go missing. India, especially, and not just India, Abhaya, whole of South Asia. This is a huge issue in Nepal and Pakistan as well, to be honest with you. And so, and you know that anyways. So yeah, where do we start? I mean, I just because the dehumanization and marginalization of Dalit Adivasis in India, especially around concerns of conservation, has been acute. I mean, they have been at the receiving end of ecological practice in many ways. For example, every time there has been a discussion on getting a park recognized as a national park, the people who have been moved out are Dalit Adivasis. And one of the worst case scenarios that I
Yeah.
know from my part of the world, from Bengal, is when, in the name of conservation of Project Tiger, people who are living in the Sundarbans in the island of Moridchapi, and Amitav Ghosh has also written about it, and there have been several writings. Anuj Ailase's work is also there. They were brutally shot dead
Yeah.
because they were largely Dalits. In fact, even after the partition of India, when Dalit populations arrived in India, they were mostly put near national parks and other areas, and not in one of the most difficult terrains in the country. So there's so much to unpack. I just don't know where to start from. So in my research, I'm trying to do that. Especially in the context of water, the idea here is to kind of start unsettling these colonial Brahminical narratives of water management by foregrounding more stories and narratives of other ways of looking at water coming from lived experiences of labor.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
these living traditions need to be foregrounded in the decolonizing discussion, which we are not getting. So yeah, there's so much to talk
I
about
think,
this. I'm just going to close myself now because yeah, Madhu, please.
yeah,
But
just
yeah.
one. Yeah, I think one quick thing I wanted to respond to was this. I agree that there is a flattening of humans when you talk about humans and nature, and I think we may have done a bit of that ourselves here. But I think it's really important not to do that, and that's something that I'm also consciously pushing myself to not do, because it's easy in the environmental context to talk about humans are creating all these problems, and I'm constantly questioning now, which humans. You have to specify who is actually causing damage to nature and who isn't, and how people are being damaged in the process. So the fights for environmental justice includes humans and non-humans who are at the receiving end of the capitalist colonial systems that are all about extracting resources, whether they are human resources or non-human resources. And I think that's one of the big problems that we have to unpack now.
And just to add to that, Madhu, I think the most flattening discourse is Anthropocene. And that could be a conversation later. Yes.
So I see Emily, my colleague here, has a hand up next.
Hello. Thank you so much for this talk. I learned a tremendous amount. So I'll first just say, as an oral historian, I really appreciate your narrative first approach, and who can argue with the story of the yak herders whose hearts are set on fire, as you say, when their huts are burned and their communities and traditions are completely destroyed, and then we find out they had this crucial role to play. As a non-scientist, non-ecologist who is deeply suspicious of high science, profit, generating motivations of companies like Colossal Biosciences, I was wondering if you could speak to this a little bit, and specifically the way that they claim to be working with indigenous communities on filling these puzzle piece type gaps that have been created in ecologies globally. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Colossal, that's been in the news with the dire wolf so-called de-extinction recently. It's one that I think has a lot of us biologists pulling our hair out. So I would distinguish it from a lot of mainstream, my scientist colleagues are also critical of what's happening there. So it's fringe science at best, but also the whole idea of de-extinction, I think, is an extension also of this commodification of nature and other species. To think that you can just, bring them back at will. We have the technology. So it's yet another technological fix, which doesn't address the underlying processes that have led to the extinction of certain things. And of course, you have to think about what are the species they're trying to de-extinct. These are all the highlighted ones are mammoths, or woolly mammoths, or dire wolves that went extinct a long time ago, and they've not been part of ecosystems for a long time. So again, it's separating a species out of its ecological context and thinking you can just bring that back and restore systems. That's not how ecology works either. I don't know. So that was just specifically about colossal, but Amitangshu, do you have a broader response?
No, I mean, we have the same problem in India right now with the cheetah, which has been brought in, and now I just heard, like last week, they're trying to edit the gene to kind of bring back the Indian cheetah. In case you haven't heard, Madhu. So
I have not
this
heard
is becoming
that yet.
very fashionable and extremely worrying. And yeah.
Vivek?
I think we
Okay.
have one
Yeah.
question
One
from
question,
Vivek.
maybe? Yeah.
Yeah, Vivek. Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Madhu and Dr. Amitangshu. The discussion was very insightful for me, and I very important point I want to reflect upon is the issue of reproducing coloniality in the post-colonial system. Right, for example, in India, we have the current issue of I'm speaking the viewpoint from the opposite side, the other side of what Abhi had discussed, from an oppressor angle. So, inspired from the land acknowledgement rituals from Canada, I started practicing it in a Indian scenario while doing presentations about soil erosion related studies in the tribal regions. I could see some amount of animosity from the audience and people who are in power when I acknowledge that I am from oppressor community and I am very conscious of my positionality. So, and I recognize especially the conflict in the agricultural systems. People who are from landowning communities from the plains are migrating to the with huge resources or migrating to the hill areas where tribal people are doing agriculture, grabbing their lands and doing agriculture by appropriating their resources. So this is in these kind of scenarios, land acknowledgement becomes very much necessary. I think I see the discussions which are given in this decoloniality paper emphasizing about importance of land acknowledgement is transferable to the Indian scenario among our own structural power imbalances. How to handle this kind of animosity, especially I'm reading Dr. Amitangshu's paper discussing about sensorial scripts of indigenous communities. When they discuss about their resources, like water in the soils also, they have their own sensorial scripts in their own languages. So only by protecting their languages, especially the current language debates that is happening in India, are mostly between two so-called classical languages, Tamil and Sanskrit or Hindi. But there is very few discussions happening around what is happening to the tribal languages, who are most endangered, and they're also located in biodiversity hotspots. So how to handle these animosities and lack of or neglect which we could see in the post-colonial scenario. Thank you.
There's a lot to
Madhu?
unpack there.
Yeah.
Uh,
Vivek, this is yeah, that would take 2 hours, but what I can
Yeah.
quickly suggest at this point of time, which I'm very grateful that you brought this up,
Yeah.
and language is a key issue also when we talk about, nature-society relations. I just go back to the fact that we had this thing called People's Biodiversity Registers,
Mhm.
which was kind of promoted under the National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan, like almost 10, 15 years ago. Kalpavriksha played a very big role in that. And it was scuttled by the government then, totally. But that was a wonderful way to bring about a certain consensus around your own linguistic articulation of your own natural world. And that could have been a
Yeah.
beautiful way to, at least start that conversation, but we lost it. So if we could
Yeah.
reclaim that, that would be very nice. That's my only comment at this point of time. So
Yeah.
thank you for bringing this up.
And a quick thing I would say that I find myself sort of, again, caught up in a lot of this when trying to apply sort of frameworks of decoloniality to India, because I think we've had layers of colonial oppressions that existed before British colonization. The caste system, the hierarchies of power are much more deeply embedded in Indian power structures for a very long time. Some of them are colonial, some of them are sort of, not colonial in the modern sense. And so there's a lot to unpack, and it's not the same thing as decolonization in the US or in African countries or other parts of the world.
Right. And I think just a word for Vivek and Abhaya would be that please don't give up hope. There's so
Yeah.
much work to be done on this. It's, yeah, this is the right point in history that change happens. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to pick up on the point you made earlier that the Western conception of humans separated from nature is in many ways pre-Darwinian. You know, it's like Noah's Ark.
Yep. Yep.
And it assumes an assumption of harmony in nature, such that if you leave nature alone, it will strike some kind of
Yep.
harmonious balance. So the whole conservation movement, I think, is predicated on that.
Yes.
And based on what we now know from an evolutionary perspective and from an ecological perspective, we know that nature is an extremely complex system. So the interconnectedness, humans have always been a part of it. All these wonderful discoveries about the influence of humans on their landscape pre-agricultural, all of this is basically new scientific knowledge. And I think in some ways it's converging on indigenous knowledge, because indigenous knowledge never had that separation in the first place. And always, you know, had to be systemic, you might say, because reductionism is a luxury. And I think many societies and many worldviews do not have the luxury of reductionism. They have to be pattern recognition systems and all of that. But a point that I want to make is that the amount of knowledge we need about one of the things it says is that since natural systems don't manage themselves, we have to decide, what are we trying to work towards here? Are we trying to work towards social justice? Yes. Biodiversity? Yes. Certain kinds of biodiversity, like wetlands versus something else? Yes. And then how do we set about managing that? I love your story about how this wonderful wetland actually was the duck hunting reserve of a king 200, 200 years ago. I mean, it's up to decide what we want collectively.
Yep. Yep.
By way of nature and humanity, and to work towards it, which is going to be an enormous social engineering problem requiring the best of our scientific knowledge, in addition to being participatory, respectful of other forms of wisdom. And so just, I wondered, I mean, that's my own assessment. And I just wondered if you could comment on that in any way that you.
Yeah. One quick thing I want to also be clear that just as we talked about not flattening humanity, we should also not flatten our idea of indigenous knowledge, because there's many different kinds of indigenous knowledges and different ways that people are related to nature. But that aside, I think, yeah, your point is really important to think about how our growing understanding of people's role in ecosystems is in a way, science is sort of coming around to recognizing that humans are part of these systems, right? Recent archaeological discoveries are forcing us to recognize the role of humans in structuring patterns of biodiversity in the Amazon or in the Pacific Northwest, where these are biodiversity hotspots where people assume that nature did it by itself, but it turns out humans played a role. So recognizing sort of that humans have been part of these systems, even in the most remote wilderness, quote unquote, areas, is really important. And I think what needs to happen from the sciences also is sort of reframing some of the conceptualization of that away from that Cartesian sort of divide between human and non-human, and towards more of a systems thinking. And that's something that I emphasize in my teachings, as in my classroom stuff as well, is we need to start looking at things as complex systems that interact with each other, and look for how patterns of power emerge in those contexts, and how we can start changing those patterns of power in order to try and protect the whole, rather than focusing on prioritizing humans over others, or some humans over other humans as well.
Yeah.
And just to kind of add in, Madhu, I feel that first of all, just to, the fact is, it's something I'm working on for a paper right now, but we also need to be careful about how we frame these different terms like traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, because I feel that these modifiers are also doing certain problematic things that we need to engage with in terms of, how we classify what we classify. And often the question is, who classifies what as local, traditional, or indigenous is also a big matter of discussion here. Do people themselves do that, or are other people doing it for them? And I think what we also need here is a more plural understanding of science. I think this
Yeah.
is very critical, especially in the decolonial context, because to kind of expect science to sit in just one place, and that's also my concern around decolonization, because I sometimes see that decolonization becomes a reform agenda, so that it becomes decolonization is necessary to do better science. But the question also we are asking is, can we reimagine science? Can we do a different kind of science? And I think that is also a conversation we need to have, because otherwise it becomes a reformation project within science itself. So how do we kind of also look at it from other perspectives? So yeah, those are the two things that I wanted to throw into that that point you were making.
Yeah. I'd like to make a final comment myself. Hopefully I'm not speaking too much, and I continue to invite other people to raise their hands. But for me, as someone who has studied, I began my career studying biological evolution, but was then part of the expansion of evolutionary theory beyond the biological sciences to include cultural evolution. What it does is it's the most anti-flattening outcome that you could imagine, because it invites us to imagine cultural diversity as like biological diversity, the great bushy tree of cultural diversity, human cultural diversity, and animal cultural diversity is much like the great bushy tree of biological diversity. And that means every enduring cultural form, the reason it endures is because it adapts the human population to its environment, and it has the necessary structure in order
Yeah.
to do so. And so taking the entire gestalt that has been developed around the concept of biological evolution and then moving it over to the study of cultural evolution, I think there's tremendous metaphorical transfer. And you cannot be a flattener
Yeah.
if you do that. It's
Yeah.
it's diversity is, I mean, there's very general principles at play, which results in very unique outcomes. That's true. Evolution is a general theory, and every species is unique. And so we can say that, cultural evolution is a very general theory, and every product is unique. I mean, it's so amazing in so many different ways. And so I look forward to basically just, continuing this agenda. I think there's so much at
Yeah.
play, and there's so much insight that's forthcoming from on the scientific end, but from complex system science plus generalized Darwinism, as we put it here at Pro-Social World. And it's so respectful, I think. I mean, we began at the very beginning with the acronym WEIRD, Western Educated, Industrial, Rich, Democratic, and the need to go beyond weird.
Yeah.
And so that's like, the scientific part of it becoming aligned and now, sailing in a positive direction towards this, as opposed to being part of the problem. And so I really look forward to what the near future will bring, and to playing a part in it, both as an individual and as an organization, with Pro-Social World um, being a um, contributing partner, as it has been with this special issue, and with this conversation, and so on. And that's, I think, future orientation. What can we do, please? And how can we work together even more than we are, is, I think, maybe the best way to round out this meeting. Maybe you could offer some final reflections. And Eric, I might invite you to also, plus anyone else. We like to do checkouts, I think, even single word checkouts for those who haven't had a chance to speak. And you could do it in your chat also. But maybe have a final round of commentary on your part. And Eric, maybe you could step in, and then we could close it out with anyone expressing anything they like leaving this session.
Eric, you want to jump in, or?
Go ahead first.
No, I think I really appreciate how you and David's work here has given us a platform to talk about these things, with our special collection of essays earlier, and this conversation now. So certainly, I think we need to look at different ways of expanding our scientific frameworks, and also engaging with the power structures outside in a more conscious and responsible way, looking at science's role in society, not as something abstract and not as something that's removed from structures of power, but also how science intersects with structures of power, and then consciously thinking about that. So pro-social, your approach using what you said, generalized Darwinism is interesting. Is one I've been following for a while. I think there are conversations to be had about how that intersects with, and what challenges there might be with the decolonial frameworks towards that. But we need plurality. As you said, the whole thing about one thing, if you want to take away from evolutionary biology, in my understanding, is diversity, right? Diversity is the key thing, and diversity of solutions depending on what the context is. That's the approach we need, instead of flattening everything into one kind of power structure, which is what has happened effectively, right? The dominant powers have a tendency to sort of put everything into one framework and think that that's the only way to do things. We need plurality. We need the term that's applied in decolonial theory is the pluriverse, which is a term that Walter Mignolo has used, and so different. Instead of a university, can we imagine a pluriversity where you have plurality of viewpoints coexisting, and people being able to hold more than one idea in your head and apply them appropriately in the context as it's relevant, rather than thinking that science or a particular model of science is the only way to do things.
Yeah. Thank you.
Amitangshu?
Oh,
Or
okay. So no,
Eric?
because no, I just
Just put
no,
me-
it's been fascinating here because I'm totally not from the field at all, and it's been to be in this platform is very interesting for me as well. And I was also wondering when I was listening to all the conversation, is that as I recognize the need for acknowledging colonial history in ecology, in the study of ecology, I also recognize the need for bringing more ecology into the study of history. And I
Yeah.
kind of see
Yes.
that's also happening in some way in the humanities and the social sciences. And I feel this is where there's going to be a lot of bridge building that's going to happen between these communities when we talk to each other. Because I just read a beautiful essay on the sesame seed by a scholar from the US, which was, I think, in the Smithsonian, that science mag, which I also shared with you, Madhu, yesterday. And it was beautiful reconstitution of the history of of enslaved people and their pain and their suffering, but through the story of the sesame seed. And it was amazing. And I felt that this is the kind of writing, the kind of engagement that we need more when we're talking about decolonizing ecology. So yes, these are very challenging times, but also very interesting and inspiring times. And so yeah, I look forward to the latter part more.
Right. Thank you so much. Eric.
I just want to thank you both for this very engaging discussion. It's been wonderful to see you again, Madhu, and
And I
to
wish we had
have all
time to
these
hear
ideas
about.
explored.
I just wanted to say that, before you wrap up, is that you actually, to me, are sort of an embodiment of that connection between ecology and history, given your own work. So hopefully we'll get to talk about your work sometime too.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
so I just want to thank you both. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Awesome. Well, this is a great inaugural
I didn't know
event
this
for
was
us, and
inaugural.
I think
Yeah.
that will be, one of the future events, not the next one, but the one after, I think, is going to be with an evolutionary anthropologist named Vivek Venkatamaran,
Okay.
who on hunter-gatherer societies and what they have to say, current hunter-gatherer societies, what they have to tell us about both human origins and modern
nice.
democracy. And my podcast with him,
Oh,
I think
sorry.
Julia just put it in the chat, two-part podcast, about 3 hours of conversation, and really updating us on our
Fantastic.
current academic knowledge of hunter-gatherer societies and their relevance. So that's going to be a topic of one of our next ones coming up, including other topics such as artificial intelligence and how that can become pro-social. So that's the kind of the scope of our topics, anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective, as we like to say. So anyhow, thank you so much for your time and all of your talents. And I think that'll wrap it up for today.
Thanks, David.
Thank you
Thanks
for
for
having us.
having us. Thanks, Eric. And
Okay.
the team. You've been amazing.